Okay, so get this picture in your mind, right? A 7,000 square foot mansion in San Francisco. But instead of, fancy furniture and all that, it's crammed full of military weapons.
Whoa.
We're talking serious stuff. Anti-tank cannons, mortars, grenades, enough to fill 3 army trucks.
Wow. That's
Crazy, right? And this wasn't some arms dealer or a military base or something.
right.
This was the home of William Thor. William Thorson III to be exact.
Haters. Okay.
Yeah. Son of a Chicago steel tycoon.
So you'd think a life of luxury, right? But this guy, William, he's got this whole other side to him, a dark side, you know?
Yeah, and it's like right from the start, there are all these red flags,
Yeah.
Like stays in psychiatric hospitals as a teenager making violent threats.
Really?
And there's even a possible connection to this unsolved murder with a steel drum involved. It's pretty creepy.
A steel drum.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Okay, so it sounds like a life of privilege gone very wrong.
Totally. And then you've got his wife, Louise. She was the one caught trying to smuggle his weapons.
Okay, now that's interesting.
Right. So was she in on it, helping him with all this dangerous stuff? Or was she a victim? Was he manipulating her? That's what we're trying to figure out.
All right, I'm hooked.
Yeah.
Let's start at the beginning then, with William's early life.
Okay, so William grows up in Kenilworth, Illinois. It's this ritzy suburb of Chicago, like picture those John Hughes movies.
Okay, yeah, I get it.
Big houses, perfect lawns, the whole deal. But William and his brother, Richard, they're like the neighborhood menaces.
Oh, no, really?
Yeah, they were always causing trouble, getting into fights, destroying things.
Huh. So the wealth didn't exactly buy them happiness, it seems.
No, not at all. And actually, Richard seemed to kind of grow out of it as they got older.
Okay.
But William, his problems just kept getting worse.
And that's what landed him in those psychiatric hospitals.
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
Oh, and speaking of disturbing things, there's this unsolved murder from 1957 that we need to talk about. Judith Mae Anderson, a 15-year-old girl. It really hangs over William's past.
Okay, what happened?
So Judith's body was found. She had been decapitated, and her body was put in a steel drum. It's really gruesome.
Oh my gosh, that's awful. And what's the connection to William?
Well, he was questioned by the police, for one thing.
Mhm.
And there are reports that he used to talk about, cutting off heads.
Oh.
And he was really interested in steel barrels. Like, unnaturally interested.
Okay, so now the steel drum thing is even creepier. Do we know anything about the type of drum it was?
Well, there's this author, Glenn Wall, who's been researching William for years.
Okay.
And he claims the drums used to get rid of Judith's body had traces of chemicals that are specific to, steel production.
Oh, wow, really? Wait, wasn't William's family in the steel business?
Exactly. His father was a steel tycoon, remember? So it's like this really unsettling coincidence, or maybe something more than a coincidence.
That's a huge red flag. So we've got this dark cloud hanging over William, and then he meets Louise.
Right. They meet in 1958, get married in 1960.
Right.
And, well, William doesn't exactly become a model citizen after that either.
Yeah. Like, what do you mean?
Oh, he gets into all sorts of trouble. Stealing canoes, petty theft. There was even an assault charge.
Wow. This guy just can't seem to stay out of trouble.
It's like he was almost rebelling against all the privilege he had.
Yeah, but in the most destructive way possible.
Right. And through all of this, Louise is right there with him. She's seeing his obsession with weapons firsthand.
And it was a real obsession, right? You said their house was basically an arsenal.
It was insane. Guns, explosives everywhere. It's hard to imagine Louise being okay with all of that.
Right, it doesn't really add up.
And that's where things get really interesting.
Mhm.
Because at first, she gets arrested for smuggling the weapons.
Okay, so it seems like she was involved.
Yeah, but then during her trial, a totally different picture starts to emerge.
Oh, what happened?
Well, the trial revealed how abusive William was toward Louise.
Oh, no.
And it came out that he had even tried to have her killed. It turned out she was living in constant fear.
Wow, so the smuggling charges were just the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly. She was basically trapped in this horrifying situation.
And she shot him in self-defense.
It seems like that's exactly what happened.
This is a wild story, but before we get too far ahead, didn't you mention something about William's brother earlier? Richard?
Oh, yeah. Richard's death. It was super suspicious.
What happened?
So in 1965, Richard is found dead in a car. Gunshot wound to the head.
Oh, my.
And at first, they ruled it a suicide. But there were all these things that didn't add up.
Like what?
Well, Richard was left-handed, but the shot came from the right side of his head.
Suspicious.
And there was no suicide note or anything.
Okay, and what does this have to do with William?
Well, later on, William actually confessed to Louise that he had Richard killed.
He confessed.
Yeah. Apparently he wanted Richard's inheritance.
So he had him murdered for money.
It sure seems that way. He told Louise he had hired someone to do it, but then later he said he killed that guy too because he was feeling guilty about it all.
He killed the hitman.
Yeah, he said he beat him to death right there in that mansion.
This is getting more and more disturbing. And the police never investigated Richard's death further.
Well, remember, William's family was incredibly powerful and influential.
Right, they were basically royalty in Chicago.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's very possible they used that power to cover things up. We'll probably never know for sure what happened.
It's like a real-life conspiracy thriller.
Right. So we've got William, clearly a dangerous guy, amassing this huge arsenal. It makes you wonder, what was he planning?
Yeah, what was his end game with all those weapons? Did he ever say?
He never really articulated a clear plan. Some people think he was preparing for some kind of, like, militia uprising or something.
Really?
Yeah. Others think he was just obsessed with power, with having control.
That's a scary thought. But it kind of fits with everything else we know about him.
Right. And then, get this, Glenn Wall, the author we talked about before, he believes William might be connected to even more murders.
Wait, there's more. On top of Judith, his brother, and the hitman, who else?
Well, there's Valerie Percy, the daughter of a businessman who later became a senator.
Right.
She was stabbed to death in 1966, and the FBI actually suspected William. Apparently, he was known to break into houses, and he had access to military bayonets.
Bayonets?
Yeah. And guess what? They found one near the crime scene.
Okay, so that's 2 potential murders that we know of.
Yeah.
And you said there were more.
Well, Glenn Wall also has this theory that William could be
Could be what?
the Zodiac Killer.
The Zodiac Killer.
I know, right? It sounds crazy, but there's some interesting connections.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more. All right, so picture this. London in the 1830s. Fog everywhere, dim gaslights, grime, and mystery around every corner. It's like the perfect setting for a spooky story, you know?
It's like something out of a Dickens novel.
Right. And into the scene comes Spring-Heeled Jack, this mysterious figure that becomes like the embodiment of all the fears people had back then.
It's interesting how he preyed on the most vulnerable people, especially women who were out alone at night.
Yeah, that's a really important part of this whole thing. Remember that letter sent to the Lord Mayor of London?
Oh, the one where they were begging him to do something about these attacks.
Yeah, exactly. The letter talks about women being terrified, unable to sleep, some even going mad from fear. It's clear these attacks were causing real trauma.
And what did the Lord Mayor do about it?
Well, he basically laughed it off, called it hysteria, and dismissed the whole thing. It just shows how little those in power cared about the dangers women faced back then.
It's kind of a familiar story, isn't it? How often are women's concerns dismissed or downplayed?
Yeah, unfortunately, it makes you wonder how many real threats were ignored just because they were seen as women's problems.
Right. Okay, so back to Spring-Heeled Jack. We know there were all these rumors and sightings, but was there any real evidence of these attacks?
Oh, yeah. There were definitely specific incidents, and one of the most important ones was the attack on Jane Alsop.
Remind me about that one again.
So Jane was 18 years old, and she was tricked into going outside by a guy pretending to be a policeman.
A policeman?
Yeah, he said he'd caught Spring-Heeled Jack, but when Jane got close, it wasn't a policeman at all.
What was it?
It was this terrifying figure, breathing fire with glowing eyes and metal claws. It sounds like something out of a nightmare.
Wow, that's intense.
And he attacked her right there on her doorstep, tearing at her clothes and hair. It was brutal.
Thankfully, people took her story seriously.
Yeah, probably because she came from a well-off family. They had more influence, you know. If it had been a working-class woman, her story might have been ignored like the others.
So what happened after Jane's attack? Did the police actually investigate?
They did. They questioned a bunch of suspects, but no one was ever arrested. One detective, James Lee, he tried to say it was all just a prank.
A prank? Seriously?
Yeah, he said it was probably some guy in a costume messing around.
That seems really dismissive, especially after what Jane went through.
It's easier to believe in a prank than to accept that there might be a real monster out there, I guess.
True. And then there's that whole thing about the W embroidered on the attacker's cloak.
Oh, yeah, that detail is interesting.
Right. It leads to one of the most popular theories about Spring-Heeled Jack's identity, the Marquis of Waterford.
Ah, yes, the notorious party animal.
Huh.
He definitely had a reputation for being a bit of a wild man.
He was known for pulling pranks, and not always harmless ones.
Right, so he had the personality for it, for sure. What else points to him?
Well, he was rich, so he could have easily afforded costumes and gadgets, maybe even those spring-heeled boots.
Yeah, that makes sense. And didn't you say his coat of arms had a W on it?
Exactly. It
Yeah.
seems like a perfect fit, doesn't it?
It does. But is there any real proof that he was Spring-Heeled Jack?
That's the thing. There's no solid evidence. No one ever saw him in the act. It's all just speculation.
So could it have been all just a big, elaborate prank by a bored nobleman?
It's possible. But we also have to consider that maybe once the legend of Spring-Heeled Jack took hold, it inspired other people to copy him.
Oh, like copycats.
Exactly. There was actually an incident where a guy claiming to be Spring-Heeled Jack attacked a woman. It seems like the legend became real in a way.
That's a scary thought. It's like the story took on a life of its own.
Right. And then there's the theory that it was all just mass hysteria, that people were so scared they started seeing things that weren't really there.
That's interesting, especially considering the time period. Women in Victorian London faced a lot of danger and restrictions.
So maybe Spring-Heeled Jack was a way for them to express their fear, even if he wasn't a real person.
It's like he became a symbol of the very real threats they faced every day.
And as the legend evolved, he even became a bit of a hero.
Oh yeah, in those penny dreadful stories, it's kind of a weird twist.
Why do you think that happened? Why did people start seeing him as a protector?
Maybe because they needed someone to protect them and there wasn't anyone else, so they created this fantasy figure who would stand up for them.
So Spring-Heeled Jack, the monster, became Spring-Heeled Jack, the vigilante.
Exactly. It's like he reflected the changing hopes and fears of the people who told his story.
And that brings us to another famous Jack who terrorized London, Jack the Ripper.
Yeah, the parallels between them are pretty chilling.
It's almost like Spring-Heeled Jack was a precursor to Jack the Ripper, a warning sign of the darkness to come.
Right. They both targeted women. They both used the darkness of the city to their advantage.
And we still don't know who either of them really was.
It makes you wonder if they were just products of their time or if they represent something deeper, something darker about human nature.
That's a great question.
Ah,
And it's one we'll probably never have a definitive answer to. You know, it's amazing how these stories from so long ago can still give you chills, right?
yeah, they definitely have a way of sticking with you.
Is it the mystery of it all? The fact that we still don't know who these guys were? Or is there something else, something deeper that gets to us?
I think it's probably a bit of both. There's that natural human curiosity, the wanting to solve a puzzle, but then there's also the fear, right? The idea that someone like that could be lurking in the shadows.
Yeah, and the fact that both Spring-Heeled Jack and Jack the Ripper targeted
Right.
women specifically, it adds this whole other level to it.
Totally. It makes you think about how vulnerable women must have felt back then, especially walking alone at night.
And honestly, a lot of women still feel that way today.
It's true. Unfortunately, those fears are still very real for a lot of people.
It's like these stories, even though they're from another time, they still reflect problems we're dealing with now.
Exactly. They force us to confront these uncomfortable truths about power and violence and how they play out in society.
We might never know for sure who Spring-Heeled Jack or Jack the Ripper were, but their stories still have a lot to teach us.
Absolutely. They remind us to be aware, to look out for each other, and to always question the systems that allow these kinds of things to happen.
So what do you think, for all of us listening out there? What's the takeaway from all of this? Why should we care about these stories from so long ago?
Well, I think it's important to learn from the past, right? To see how these patterns of fear and violence repeat themselves.
Yeah, to see how easily people can be manipulated, how fear can be used as a weapon.
And I think by understanding these stories, we can be more aware of those dangers in our own lives, in our own communities.
So maybe by digging into these dark corners of history, we can actually find a way to create a better future.
I believe that's possible. By facing our fears, by acknowledging the darkness, we can start to build something brighter.
That's a great point. Well, on that note, I think we've done enough digging for one day.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to stop.
To everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And remember, keep asking questions, keep exploring, and don't let the shadows scare you away from the truth.